So, we have the victims: Mary Kellerman, age 12, Adam Janis, age 27, Stanley Janis, age 25, Teresa Janis, age 19, Mary McFarland, age 31, Paula Prince, age 35, and Mary Reiner, age 27. All of them died after taking Tylenol. The Janices all took from the same bottle, and the others took from different bottles. They found out that some of the bottles were from the same lot, and those were recalled. But when others also died from extra strength Tylenol, but with from different or from bottles with from different lots, a lot of the bottles from Johnson of extra strength Tylenol was recalled. Uh, all victims died very quickly, and they were connected pretty quickly, especially when the Janices all died from taking after taking Tylenol from the same bottle. So they checked the bottle and found that there was a very large doses of cyanide. And then when we come to the suspects, we have Roger Arnold, which was very reasonably quickly dismissed. He bragged about having potassium cyanide. He was a home chemist, and a lot of leads pointed in his direction. He was also just an odd guy. Uh, but they quickly found out he didn't really have the things necessary. He did apparently have some Tylenol or some cyanide, but not the right kind, and he didn't really have enough and such. So he was quickly dismissed as just a bad timing.
November 6th, a call came in that got their attention.
A bar owner called and said that one of his semi-regulars, a man named Roger Arnold, had been in the bar and was bragging about having cyanide in his home, and not just any cyanide, potassium cyanide, the kind that was used in the murders. And he was kind of an odd guy. He was an amateur home chemist, if you will, and he coincidentally worked as a dockhand for Jewel Food Stores. And Jewel is one of the stores where two of the bottles have been purchased, one by the Kellerman family and another one by the Janis family. So the bar owner had called Chicago Police Department and said, you should check this guy out.
But then Robert Richardson, or rather James Lewis, he was found out because of an extortion letter to blame the police, or Johnson was sent an extortion letter that blamed Frederick Miller.
When they discovered the possible connection between Robert Richardson and the extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson, the FBI put out a wanted poster of him with his picture, and it was distributed across the country.
And
at least used his bank account. So the police connected the bank account to Frederick Miller, and when Frederick Miller was asked if anyone had anything against him, he quickly said Robert Richardson. His name and picture was caught or was shown on news, and someone quickly sat a police man actually recognized him on the TV and just thought, that's James Lewis. So in that sense, he was also investigated for other crimes in 1977, a homicide case, and a 1981 credit card scam. He denied the murders and even helped police, but there was still this suspicion that he could have done it, and that he was the best subject, especially because some of the drawings he made of how exactly to do it and how to exactly contaminate the Tylenol and how easy it would be made him very suspicious, and it made very little sense about how much he actually knew. But he helped the police in their investigation, and he died in 2023, so there is nothing that can't be done, even if we later found out that it is him. But he never agreed or confessed to the murders and said that he actually did it.
The podcast is mostly told like a completely normal story. We start at the beginning of what has happened, and then we slowly introduce step by step, so we can follow it in a chronological way, which also makes it easier to understand the developments of the case. So we don't just jump around in what happened, but actually follow like a timeline. And for an example, the story starts with the first death and then gradually moves into investigation and its consequences. So we slowly build up to this tension that is in the story. So we follow it like a timeline. In the podcast, there are two different narrators. The one we hear the most about is Phoebe Judge, who is like the main narrator, and she tells the story in a calm and mostly natural way, very objective, which makes it really easy to just listen to the story without really feeling like you've got to have an opinion on it. However, she still guides the listener and then chooses what they want, the people who created the podcast want us to hear and feel in the story. I have watched a documentary on this case, and there were a lot of different things that wasn't included in the podcast, where you clearly can see they chose what they want to talk about and tell, and not what objectively happened. There are also people in the story who have experienced the events themselves, mostly children, at the time of the crime, and investigator and journalist to speak more personally. And that also gives the contrast between having the some objective narrator and then have the subjective experience from the different people who have might been through it. In the story, it is pretty organized and it follows a sequence of events. However, when the narrator switches between different speakers, it can feel slightly confusing because you don't know what's going on now, and it feels a bit like you're jumping. But despite this, the overall structure remains logical, and we first get information about the deaths, and then the investigation, and later the suspects. But some part of the story feels a bit incomplete, which also reflects that the case was never solved. But you also feel a bit like you need to have the opinion that the narrator and different people telling the story has. Suspense is a big part of the podcast because it slowly builds up when there are coming new information, which is also very not common in crime and true crime, especially because you need to feel that build up also to be drawn to listen to the rest of the story. And you also have the feeling like, when is it gonna get solved? When is the big high point where what we find out this person did it? But in this story, this podcast, it ends with no one gets to be the murder or the killer, so you feel a bit disappointed at the end that it's like unsolved and a cold case. But we still have one few persons we think it could be them, and we are pretty sure it may be them, but we still don't know. And for example, when a suspect is introduced, it feels like the answer is close. It's like it seemed like they were getting closer to the truth from the podcast, like they said. However, the mystery remains unsolved. So we don't really know what happened, and you really want to know what happened. The main focus is on the investigation and the suspects, rather than the victims. We don't really know much about the victims or how it was to be part of it all, or what they have been through, or more their case. You just hear about the story and more focus on how it was, all the people that they had as suspects and their stories, where it can feel a bit narrow-minded that we don't know anything about the victims and it just the suspects and nothing else is important, and that's a bit irritating. The story is mostly told objectively, but we have still some points in the story or podcast where we feel a bit drawn to. You need to decide this part is more real and more right than the other. For an example, we have the main suspect, which is James Lewis, also the man in the picture, who's like especially the person, their main suspect in the story, also in the case when it happened, but it was never proven that he committed the murders. But it's like it still continues to be important to just continuously say that he did it, and you end up being a bit like he didn't do it, but the podcast makes one more likely to say he did it, but it was never confirmed, and that's not very objective. But the way the story is told and the rest of it is pretty objective.
For the attention model, the subject are the investigators, the police and the FBI. They want to solve the case and bring justice. The center are the people calling 911 about the deaths. They send for help to the authorities and let them know about the deaths. Without them, the story wouldn't have begun. The culprit is the object. The goal is to catch the culprit and bring them to justice, potentially also to stop the deaths by making the safety seals, which is the main outcome of the case. Receiver. There is yet to be a receiver. It would be like the population and the investigators, but the culprit was never caught, so it is unfinished. The helper. James William Lewis and Dr. Thomas. James was the prime suspect, but became a helper because while he was thought to be the culprit multiple for a lot of the time, he was not deemed guilty, but helped the investigation by making plans and such. Dr. Thomas was the first to figure out it was cyanide in the pills and that it was the tylonol that caused the deaths.
Doctor who had worked on Adam, Dr. Thomas Kim.
And he got out his medical books and began calling poison centers around the country, trying to figure out what this invisible force was.
Chuck Kramer called the hospital. He said, "There's something wrong with the Tylenol." The doctor who had treated the Janus family only knew of one chemical that could kill someone that quickly. He found a 24-hour lab and called a taxi. He put 2 vials of blood, collected from Stanley and Teresa Janus, into the taxi and told the driver where to take them. The results came back later that night, showing the presence of cyanide. When the analysis of the pills from the Janus' bottle of Tylenol came back from the county's toxicologist, the report said that 4 of the 44 capsules contained cyanide, almost 3 times the amount necessary to kill someone.
The opponent is the culprit, as well as the object, for the culprit hides and causes the deaths, and is the reason if the culprit was not hiding, the object would have been received. The project access is unfinished since the subject never received the object or got to the object, since the culprit was never found by the investigators. The conflict axis has James. James was thought to be the opponent but became a helper. So the main conflict, outside of just locating or trying to figure out who the culprit was, is that the helper became no, was that the opponent became the helper. The communication axis is also unfinished, since the object was never received and the receiver did not become actualized.
Challenges of true crime. Turning real tragedies into entertainment can be problematic because of the families that experience this pain from losing a loved one. So that could be problematic in the way that we use real tragedies to turn into entertainment that people can get entertained watching or listen to. The families can end up feeling disrespected and hurt if the way they explain the tragedies is not like fully and not getting every detail with. The podcast can influence public opinion or investigation with like sharing it and viewing it with the world, and their way of seeing it in another perspective can maybe influence on the investigation or the way that they handle it at the time, the tragedies. This story we hear here about the Tylonol murders is not fully, we don't get every single detail that is defined because we cannot know all of it, at least, but we hear like what's entertaining and some of the investigation, but we don't hear like every single little detail that has been in this crime and the investigation in this crime. So